A touching family story. Unintended misunderstandings piled up, hindering the steps toward happiness. When fate demands its price, it's often too late. This is a true and tearful story. 1. Mom comes to stay. 2 years after our marriage, my husband suggested bringing his mother to live with us, so we could care for her in her old age. My husband lost his father when he was young, and his mother was his only support. She raised him single-handedly and ensured he completed university. The phrase, bitter hardships, perfectly encapsulates my mother-in-law's fate. I quickly agreed, and began preparing a room with a south-facing balcony, one that could catch the sunlight and where she could grow flowers or plants. Standing in the sunlight-filled room, my husband didn't say a word but suddenly lifted me up and spun me around. As I struggled and protested to be put down, he said, "Let's go pick up our mom." My husband was tall and well-built. I loved resting my head against his chest, feeling as though he could scoop up my petite frame and tuck me into his pocket. Whenever we argued and stubbornly refused to make up, he would often lift me high above his head and spin me around until I was terrified and begged him to put me down. That joyful fear utterly captivated me. My mother-in-law's rural habits were hard to change. I liked buying fresh flowers to decorate the living room, but she eventually couldn't hold back and said, "You young ones are so wasteful. Why buy flowers? You can't eat them like rice." I smiled and said, "Mom, having flowers blooming in the house lifts everyone's spirits." My mother-in-law muttered under her breath, bowing her head, while my husband quickly laughed and said, "Mom, that's how city folk are. You'll get used to it over time." My mother-in-law didn't say anything more, but every time she saw me bringing flowers home, she couldn't help but ask how much they cost. When I told her, she would click her tongue in disapproval. Once, when I returned from shopping with several bags, she asked the price of each item. I answered honestly, and her disapproving sighs grew even louder. My husband pinched my nose and said, "Silly, wouldn't it be better if you didn't tell Mom the actual prices?" Our happy life quietly drifted along with its subtle, discordant notes. What my mother-in-law disliked most was seeing my husband get up to make breakfast. To her, it was unthinkable for a man to step into the kitchen and cook for his wife. At the breakfast table, her expression would often be gloomy, but I pretended not to notice. She would then rattle the dishes and chopsticks noisily, a silent protest of her dissatisfaction. I was a dance teacher at the Children's Cultural Center. Dancing was exhausting enough, and every morning, I cherished the comfort of staying wrapped in my warm blankets. I wasn't willing to sacrifice this one pleasure, so I feigned ignorance toward my mother-in-law's reactions. Occasionally, she would help with the housework, but her efforts often made things even busier for me. For instance, she would collect every plastic bag in the house, whether for groceries or trash, insisting on saving them until there were enough to sell for recycling. As a result, used plastic bags were scattered everywhere. She also avoided using dishwashing liquid, and to avoid embarrassing her, I secretly rewashed the dishes later. One evening, my mother-in-law caught me secretly rewashing the dishes. She slammed her door shut with a loud bang and cried bitterly inside her room. My husband was caught in a difficult position. After that incident, he didn't say a word to me all night. I tried to coax him and make up, but he ignored me. Frustrated, I asked him angrily, "What exactly did I do wrong?" He glared at me and said, "Why can't you just give in to Mom a little? Eating off slightly dirty dishes won't kill you, will it?" For a long time after that, my mother-in-law stopped talking to me, and the atmosphere at home became increasingly strained. During that period, my husband also seemed exhausted, unsure of whom he should try to please first. My mother-in-law decided not to let her son prepare breakfast anymore, and volunteered to take on this important responsibility herself. Watching her son happily eat breakfast brought her joy, but when she looked at me, her eyes were full of reproach, as if blaming me for failing in my duties as a wife. To avoid the awkwardness, I started grabbing a carton of milk to drink on my way to work. At bedtime, my husband, slightly disappointed, asked me, "Rhodey, are you avoiding eating at home because you think my mom's cooking isn't clean?" He turned away from me, lying with his back to me coldly, ignoring the tears that rolled down my cheeks in silent frustration. Finally, he sighed and said, "Rhodey, please, just do it for me. Can you eat breakfast at home?" So I reluctantly returned to the breakfast table every morning, hesitantly sitting there to eat. That morning, as I sipped the porridge my mother-in-law had made, I suddenly felt nauseated. My stomach churned violently, and I tried to hold it in, clamping my mouth shut, but it was no use. I dropped the bowl and chopsticks. Note: in Chinese culture, porridge is traditionally eaten with chopsticks, unlike in Vietnam, where spoons are used, and bolted to the bathroom, throwing up everything. When I finally caught my breath and calmed down, I saw my mother-in-law crying, lamenting her misfortunes in her thick rural accent. My husband stood at the bathroom door, glaring at me angrily. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. I hadn't done it on purpose. For the first time, my husband and I had a fierce argument. At first, my mother-in-law sat silently watching us, but then she got up and slowly walked out the door. My husband shot me a resentful look before heading downstairs to follow her. 2. The dark days. For 3 days, my husband didn't come home or call. I was angry. I thought to myself, ever since my mother-in-law moved in, I've endured enough hardship. What more do they want from me? Yet strangely, I kept feeling nauseous. Nothing I ate tasted good, and the housework was piling up. My mood was utterly terrible. A colleague eventually said to me, "Rody, you look awful. You should see a doctor." The doctor's diagnosis revealed that I was pregnant. At that moment, I understood why I had thrown up that morning. Amid the happiness, there was also a tinge of resentment. Why hadn't my husband or my mother-in-law, who had experienced childbirth herself, considered this possibility? At the hospital gate, I ran into my husband. Though it had only been 3 days since we last saw each other, he looked gaunt and worn. I had intended to turn and walk away, but seeing how pitiful he looked, I couldn't help but call out to him. My husband turned at the sound of my voice and saw me, but his expression was cold, as if I were a stranger. His eyes were filled with resentment, and that look cut me deeply. I told myself not to look at him. Don't look at him. Don't look at him. I waved down a passing taxi. At that moment, I longed to cry out, "Honey, I'm going to have your child," and to be lifted into his arms, spun around in joy. But none of that happened. As the taxi pulled away, tears silently rolled down my cheeks. Why had one argument turned our love into something so terrible? After returning home, I lay in bed thinking of my husband, and the resentment I had seen in his eyes. Hugging a corner of the blanket, I cried silently. That night, I heard the sound of a drawer opening. Turning on the light, I saw my husband's tear-streaked face. He was taking money from the drawer. I stared at him coldly, saying nothing. He acted as if I wasn't there, grabbed the money and the savings book, and left. Perhaps he had truly decided to leave me. Such a wise man, keeping love and finances so neatly separated. I let out a bitter laugh, but tears noisily rolled down my cheeks again. The next day, I didn't go to work. I sorted through my thoughts, and decided to find my husband to have a clear conversation. When I arrived at his office, his secretary looked at me with some surprise and said, "The general manager Tran's mother was in a traffic accident, and is in the hospital." I stood frozen, mouth agape, before rushing to the hospital. By the time I found my husband, my mother-in-law had already passed away. My husband didn't look at me. His face was stone cold. I stared at my mother-in-law's pale, emaciated face, now lifeless and ashen. Tears streamed uncontrollably down my cheeks. Oh my God, how did it come to this? Even during her burial, my husband didn't say a single word to me. Every glance he gave me was filled with a deep-seated hatred. As for the accident, I had to ask others to piece together the story. Apparently, my mother-in-law had wandered toward the bus station, wanting to return to her hometown. The more my husband tried to follow her, the faster she walked. While crossing the street, she was struck directly by a bus. At last, I understood the depth of my husband's resentment. In his heart, I was the one indirectly responsible for his mother's death. If I hadn't been nauseous that morning, if we hadn't argued, if only. At last, I understood my husband's hatred. If I hadn't thrown up that morning, if we hadn't argued, if only. In his heart, I was the one indirectly responsible for his mother's death. My husband silently moved his things into his mother's room, and every night, he came home reeking of alcohol. I was overwhelmed by a crushing sense of self-doubt and regret, so suffocating that I could barely breathe. I wanted to explain to him, to tell him that we were going to have a baby, but when I looked into his cold eyes, I swallowed all the words I intended to say. I would have preferred if he had hit me, or yelled at me, anything, as long as he acknowledged that none of this was intentional. Days passed in repetition. My husband came home later, and later each night. I stubbornly treated him as if he were a stranger. I was the noose tightening around my husband's heart. One time, I walked past a European restaurant, and through the large transparent glass windows that stretched from the ceiling to the floor, I saw my husband sitting across from a young woman. He gently stroked her hair, and I understood everything. At first, I was stunned. Then I walked into the restaurant and stood in front of my husband, staring at him, my eyes dry and empty. I didn't want to say anything, and I couldn't say anything. The girl looked at me, then at my husband, and stood up to leave. My husband reached out and pressed her back down into her seat, and then he stared at me, just as coldly. All I could hear was the faint beat of my heart, thumping weakly, one beat after another, until it reached the brink of death. The loser was me. If I kept standing there like that, both I and the baby in my womb would fall. That night, my husband didn't come home. In his own way, he was telling me, with the death of my mother-in-law, our love had also died. My husband never came back. There were days when I came home from work and found the wardrobe disturbed. He had come back to take a few of his things. I didn't want to call him, and even the initial thought of explaining everything to him had completely disappeared. I lived alone, went to the hospital alone for prenatal checkups. Every time I saw other husbands carefully escorting their wives to the hospital for a checkup, my heart shattered. Some colleagues vaguely suggested I should have an abortion, but I stubbornly refused. I was determined to give birth to this child, as a way to atone for the death of my mother-in-law. One evening, when I came home from work, I found my husband sitting in the living room, the room clouded with cigarette smoke. On the coffee table was a piece of paper. Without even glancing at it, I knew exactly what it said. In the 2 months that my husband had been away, I gradually learned to remain calm. I looked at him, took off my hat, and said, "Wait a moment, I'll sign it." My husband just stared at me, his eyes as confused as mine. As I unbuttoned my coat, I silently told myself, "Don't cry, don't cry." My eyes ached, but I wouldn't allow the tears to fall. After hanging up my coat, my husband's gaze fixed on my now visible belly. I smiled, walked over, pulled the paper toward me, not even glancing at it, signed my name, and pushed it back toward him. "Rhodey, are you pregnant?" Since the accident with my mother-in-law, this was the first thing he had said to me. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. They spilled down my cheeks in a torrent. I answered, "Yes, but it's okay. You can leave now." My husband didn't leave. In the darkness, we looked at each other. He lay down and hugged me, his tears soaking the blanket. But in my heart, so many things had already drifted far away, so far that no matter how fast I ran, I could never catch up. I don't know how many times my husband has said, "I'm sorry," to me. I once thought I would forgive him, but I just couldn't. That moment in the European restaurant, when he looked at me with such cold eyes in front of that young woman, I could never forget it for the rest of my life. We had both carved painful scars into each other's hearts. For me, it was unintentional. For him, it was deliberate.